Hey, what's up folks? This is Keith and you're watching Barber's Auto Help. Thank you so much for watching. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to know that you have a power steering leak and how to find it. Let's go ahead and get into it. In this video, I'm going to be using this vehicle as an example. Now, this vehicle is equipped with your traditional power steering pump. It has hydraulic fluid in it, and it also has a power steering rack and pinion. Then it has lines, and also behind the grill here, it has a power steering fluid cooler. So this is your typical run-of-the-mill power steering system that has been used for many decades on a lot of vehicles out there. So how do you know that you have a power steering leak? Well, there are a few symptoms associated with the loss of power steering fluid. And one thing you may notice is fluid on your driveway. Whenever you back up to go to the grocery store or work or wherever you're going, you may notice that there are little spots up underneath the engine bay or up underneath where the power steering components would be on your pavement there. That's a good indication that something's going on. Now, that may not be power steering fluid, that may be something else, but that is one symptom of a power steering fluid leak. You may also notice that it's a little bit harder to turn your steering wheel. Increased steering effort is a symptom of fluid loss in the power steering system. Now, usually whenever you experience that, you also experience this moaning noise coming from the engine bay or from the power steering pump. A lot of times when the fluid gets low enough, air will be ingested into the power steering pump and it'll make this horrible kind of moaning noise that is very stereotypical of air in a power steering system. Let me let you listen to that noise real quick.
And the noise actually gets louder whenever you turn the wheel, of course. If you look inside here, inside the reservoir, see all the air bubbles in the fluid? It actually gets a lot worse than that. It gets real foamy. Oh, there it comes. There's some more air there. Yeah.
And another symptom, of course, and this is the most obvious, would be a low power steering fluid level. And especially if you're having to top off the power steering fluid after you found out that it was low and it keeps getting low, that's a good indication that your fluid's going somewhere. It's a closed system, or supposed to be a closed system, so if you're having to continuously add power steering fluid to the reservoir, that's an indication you got a leak somewhere. Now, how do you find the fluid leak? Well, 90% of the time, power steering fluid leaks can be found just by simply doing a visual inspection. Now, the other 10% of the time, and that's an arbitrary number I just pulled out of my hat, you have to use other means, and we'll get into that later on. But start out with a visual inspection. You want to look for fluid drips from any of the power steering components that has power steering fluid in it. Your power steering pump, your lines, especially your high pressure lines, low pressure lines, your power steering fluid cooler. Of course, your rack and pinion can leak, and also your fluid reservoir can leak as well. Now, let's zoom into these components individually and talk about where you may find some leaks on the individual components, what areas you might find these leaks at on these components. Let's start out with the power steering pump. Now, typically, in my experience, power steering pumps usually leak from the drive shaft seal. This is the front of the drive shaft, and then the pulley actually presses onto the drive shaft. But if this pulley were to be removed, you can see that the drive shaft actually goes into the front of the power steering pump itself, and there's a seal that goes around that drive shaft. A lot of times that seal will leak, so that's a good place to start by inspecting that drive shaft. Usually if you go up underneath that pulley and look straight up, you will see if it's leaking from that area. You'll see a little trail going down the front side of the pump and then dripping. Now also, where the lines go into the back side of the power steering pump, you want to check that too. That's also a potential source of a leak as well. And that's probably more due to maybe an O-ring issue or something of that nature there. That may not necessarily be a bad power steering pump per se. Now, this vehicle is equipped with a power steering pump that has the reservoir that's actually a part of the power steering pump. And there's a seal that goes between the power steering pump housing and that reservoir, and that's another potential source of a leak as well. So you want to check those things. Now, let's look at the power steering lines. The power steering lines, of course, are another potential source of a leak, and you want to inspect them all the way from whatever component they're coming from to whatever component they're going to, along the whole length of the line there. A lot of times, if you look right down here, you'll see where the line goes into whatever component you're looking at there. And in this case, this is the rack and pinion. The lines could leak right where the nut goes into the component there. And that typically is not due to necessarily a line failure. That could be a failure with the O-ring at the end of the line where the nut goes into the actual component there. So you want to inspect that and check to see if that's leaking too. Now, another potential source of leaks on a power steering line or hose is where you see these rubber lines connect to like a metal line. These crimps can fail, and a lot of times you'll see some sweating or dripping even from where that line mates up to the hose there. So that's a potential source of a leak there for you. And also wherever you see unions, you could potentially have a leak from the union right there, and that may be more like an O-ring issue. There will be an O-ring right at the end of this nut where it goes into that union there. So maybe not necessarily replace the whole line, but you could just replace the O-ring. But you do want to inspect the line along the entire length of the line. And remember, you got several lines on this: high pressure, low pressure. You got the lines going to and from the cooler, and also you got lines going to the power steering pump. So inspect all of the lines on your power steering system there and inspect for leaks. And speaking of the power steering fluid cooler, you want to inspect that also. A lot of times, especially the ones that are mounted just in front of a radiator, you may have a rock that may have flown into the actual cooler, and it may have punctured it and could cause it to leak there. But you want to inspect the whole thing, make sure it's nice and dry along the entire length and breadth of the power steering fluid cooler. And then we have our power steering rack and pinion, which is mounted just up underneath all of this. This is mounted to the frame there, and this is the component that actually steers or helps to steer your vehicle. On each end, you have inner and outer tie rod ends, and they connect to your steering knuckle, and it goes back and forth like this, steering your wheels to the right and to the left, of course. Now, some potential areas for leaks on it would be like your rack seals. On either end of the rack, you'll have seals that seal the inside of the rack from the outside, and you can't really see them because they're behind these bellow boots here, but fluid can leak from those and actually fill up those bellow boots. A lot of times that can be kind of a source of a more mysterious type of power steering fluid leak, because those bellow boots, they can hold a lot of fluid. And also those bellow boots are connected via a breather line from each end to the other. So if you were to turn the wheel from the right to the left, that fluid theoretically could go through that breather line into the other bellow boot, and you could probably accumulate a total of maybe 2.5 quarts of fluid in those bellow boots without even knowing it, because it won't drip. So you want to check that, and a lot of times what you have to do to see if you actually do have a seal leak inside the bellow boots is remove the hose clamp on the end of the bellow boot and kind of push the bellow boot back and see if you have any fluid that might drip out. But that could be very tricky. It throws a lot of technicians off and a lot of vehicle owners off, because it could leak for a long time and you're losing power steering fluid, but there's nothing dripping on the floor, but you're having to add fluid all the time. So definitely want to check that too. Also, where the input to the top of the power steering rack there's a seal right there that could potentially leak. You want to check that. And of course, the whole housing, anywhere on the whole housing of the power steering rack, if it's cracked or damaged, you could potentially have a leak in that area as well. Definitely take an eyeball to that and see if you see anything. Now, once you find your suspected source of a power steering leak, check yourself. Go ahead and dry that area off really well. Spray it down with some brake clean, get it bone dry, then operate your power steering system again. And then once you're done with that, go ahead and inspect that component one more time, just to make sure that it is indeed dripping or leaking from that area. You always want to double check your work and make sure that you are correct.
Now, a word of caution to you. If you use brake clean to clean up the power steering system, use caution because it is flammable. Do not spray brake clean on the power steering system while the engine is running, and also while the engine is hot. Before you start the vehicle up to operate the power steering system, to check yourself, be sure all the brake clean is dried and evaporated. Keep a fire extinguisher handy just in case. If you're uncomfortable using brake clean, use an engine degreaser that is not flammable. Heed all warnings applicable to the use of engine degreaser, and be careful.
Now, not all the time is it going to be that easy to find a power steering leak. Sometimes you have to do a little extra per se. Some systems are so nasty and so caked up with oil and grime and stuff, it's near impossible to tell what is leaking on it because there's just oil everywhere. Sometimes just cleaning it up first really well and then re-inspecting it afterwards goes a long way. Now, there are some cases where that doesn't even help. And in those cases, I would suggest employing some power steering fluid dye in the system. Put the dye in the reservoir or the fluid and operate the power steering system, give it a chance to leak out, and then use a UV light to inspect the entire length of the power steering system and look for wherever the dye has leaked out at, and that's where your leak is going to be at. That does work. It works really well. It's kind of like a last ditch effort though. 90% of the time you don't have to do this, but that does help in some cases where it's really difficult to tell what is what. Well folks, that is it for this video. I sincerely hope that this helped somebody. If you have any questions, comment down below. I'll be happy to get to you when I can, if I can. Also, please read the entire description down below this video before you apply any of this knowledge. There may be some things I need to clarify, and that's where I do that. And please like and subscribe. Thank you again. Bye.